My aunt stood in the doorway of my grandmother's funeral and pointed toward the parking lot. "You don't belong here, Melanie. Grandma didn't want you anywhere near this church." If that was true, why was she terrified of the sealed envelope in my hand instead of looking me in the eyes? And why did Pastor David suddenly step between us holding a folded handwritten note with my grandmother's signature? I thought I was about to lose the chance to say goodbye forever. I had no idea the real battle wasn't about a funeral. It was about a truth my grandmother had planned to reveal after her death. Before we go any further, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. If stories about family truth and quiet courage resonate with you, let me know in the comments. And if you'd like to follow this journey to the very end, I'd be grateful if you subscribed so we can continue it together. Fan Thoten. 2. 6 months before my grandmother died, my life looked exactly the way everyone in my family had always predicted it would. I was the practical one, the dependable one, the one who never made scenes. I was 35 years old, a certified public accountant, specializing in nonprofit financial compliance in Columbus, Ohio. My job involved reviewing financial records, identifying inconsistencies, and helping charities remain accountable to the communities that trusted them. Most days I spent hours explaining complicated financial reports in language ordinary people could understand. Ironically, I could recognize financial manipulation inside organizations much faster than I could recognize it inside my own family. My grandmother Eleanor Barnes used to tease me about that. "You can find one missing dollar in $1 million budget." She'd laugh while pouring coffee into 2 old ceramic mugs she'd owned for decades. "But you still think everyone around you tells the truth." She wasn't entirely wrong. Grandma had raised me almost as much as my parents had. My mother worked double shifts when I was young, and after my parents divorced, Grandma became the steady presence in my life. She never spoiled me with expensive gifts. Instead, she taught me how to balance a checkbook before I was 12, how to compare prices without feeling embarrassed, and how to keep promises even when nobody was watching. "If your name is trusted," she often said, "you'll never be poor." That sentence shaped my career. By the time I became a CPA, Grandma proudly told everyone at church that I could make numbers tell the truth. Whenever work allowed, I drove across Columbus to spend weekends with her. We'd cook together, watch old movies, or simply sit on the back porch listening to birds while she watered the flower beds Grandpa had planted years before he passed away. Nothing about those afternoons felt urgent. Looking back, I realize they were the quietest days before everything changed. My Aunt Susan Mitchell lived only 15 minutes away from Grandma, much closer than I did. After Grandma's arthritis worsened and her heart condition became more difficult to manage, Susan gradually became her primary caregiver. At first, everyone admired her, including me. She handled doctor appointments, she picked up prescriptions, she organized grocery deliveries. She drove Grandma to church every Sunday. Whenever relatives thanked her, Susan would smile modestly. "I'm just doing what family should do." Nobody questioned her. Why would they? Caregiving is exhausting, and Susan genuinely appeared devoted. During those first months, I often called before visiting. Sometimes Susan answered, "Today's probably not a good day," she'd say gently. "Your grandmother's resting." Another time she told me, "She's had visitors all morning. She really needs quiet." Or, "The nurse just got her settled. Maybe come next week." Each explanation sounded reasonable on its own. I never argued. If Grandma needed rest, the last thing I wanted was to make her day harder. Still, something felt different. When I did manage to visit, Grandma always seemed surprised to see me. "I was beginning to think work had swallowed you whole," she'd joke. I laughed the first few times. "I was just here last weekend." She looked confused. Were you I assumed age was affecting her memory. I never imagined another possibility. Then came Thanksgiving. Nearly the entire family gathered at Grandma's house. The dining room was loud, crowded, and smelled like roasted turkey sweet potatoes and cinnamon rolls. Susan floated through the room like the perfect hostess, refilling glasses before anyone asked. Whenever someone complimented her dedication, she'd shrug. I promised Mom she'd never have to worry. Everyone nodded approvingly. Then my cousin Ethan casually asked, "Melanie, are you finally visiting more often?" I smiled. "I come almost every weekend." The room became strangely quiet. Susan laughed softly. "Oh, honey." She reached over and patted my arm as though correcting a child. "I know work keeps you busy. Nobody blames you." Several relatives nodded. One aunt even said, "Your grandmother understands." I stared around the table. "I was literally here last Saturday." Susan tilted her head sympathetically. "Were you Mom slept most of that day?" Grandma looked from Susan to me. "I wish I'd known you stopped by." A knot tightened in my stomach. Something wasn't adding up. After dinner, while everyone watched football in the living room, Grandma asked if I could help organize a small desk drawer in her bedroom. It wasn't unusual. She liked having company while sorting old papers. Inside the drawer were neatly folded birthday cards, church newsletters, faded photographs, and several envelopes secured with rubber bands. As we worked, she suddenly asked, "Melanie, do you still look at financial statements every day?" I laughed. "It's kind of my job." She became unusually serious. "Good." She slid a bank statement toward me. "Would you explain something?" I studied the page. The transactions themselves weren't alarming. Monthly pension deposits, utility payments, prescription expenses, routine withdrawals. Nothing immediately stood out. "What am I looking?" Grandma lowered her voice. "I thought I had more money in that account." I checked the balance again. "It doesn't necessarily mean anything's wrong." "I know." She nodded slowly. "But I can't remember approving some of these transfers." Before I could examine the statement more carefully, Susan appeared in the bedroom doorway carrying folded towels. "There you two are." She smiled warmly. "I've been looking everywhere." Her eyes immediately landed on the bank statement in Grandma's hands. "Oh." She walked over casually and picked it up. "Those are just housekeeping expenses." Grandma frowned slightly. "I wanted Melanie to explain them." Susan laughed. "Mom, she's off the clock." Then she turned toward me. "Don't make her spend Thanksgiving working." It sounded harmless, even thoughtful. But she had answered before I could. She placed the statement back into the drawer without letting me finish reading it. Grandma didn't argue. Neither did I. Later that evening, as I prepared to leave, Grandma hugged me longer than usual. Then she whispered something so quietly I almost missed it. "Come next Tuesday. I'll be at work. Take the afternoon." There was something urgent in her voice. "I need your eyes." "My eyes?" She squeezed my hand. "The ones that notice things." I promised I'd come. The following Tuesday, I left the office early and drove straight to her house. Susan answered the door. "Oh!" She looked surprised. "I didn't know you were coming." "Grandma asked me to." Susan hesitated just long enough for me to notice. "She's sleeping. I can wait." "No need." She smiled again. "I'm sure she'll call you when she's feeling stronger." Before I could respond, I heard Grandma's voice from somewhere deeper inside the house. "Melanie." Susan froze, only for a second. Then she stepped aside. Grandma was sitting in her favorite chair by the living room window with a blanket across her lap. The moment she saw me, relief crossed her face. "I was afraid you wouldn't make it." Susan enforced another smile. "I'll make tea." As soon as she disappeared into the kitchen, Grandma reached beneath the side table and pulled out a thin manila folder. I don't have much time before she comes back. I frowned. What is this? Financial papers. I opened the folder. Bank statements, donation receipts from church, property tax notices, a few handwritten notes. Nothing dramatic. Yet. Grandma leaned closer. I've started forgetting little things. I know, but I haven't forgotten numbers. She looked directly into my eyes. Something feels wrong. I glanced toward the kitchen where dishes clinked softly. What do you want me to do? She took my hand. I don't want accusations. I know. I want facts. I nodded. I'll help you understand everything. She smiled with visible relief. Then she said the sentence that would stay with me through every painful week that followed. Promise me something. I promise. No matter what people say about you, never argue until you can prove every word. At the time, I believed she was giving me professional advice. I didn't realize she was preparing me for the day our own family would become the investigation. The following Saturday, I returned with a portable scanner tucked inside my laptop bag. It wasn't because I suspected a crime. At least not yet. Grandma had asked for help organizing her financial records, and scanning important documents was something I recommended to clients all the time. Paper gets lost, ink fades, files get misplaced, digital copies give people peace of mind. I thought I was helping my grandmother protect herself from forgetfulness. I had no idea I was preserving evidence that would soon matter far more than either of us imagined. When I arrived, Grandma was already sitting at the dining room table with several folders stacked neatly beside her. She smiled the moment she saw me. I was hoping you'd bring your magic machine. I laughed and lifted the scanner from my bag. It's not magic. It is to me. Before we could begin, Susan walked in carrying a grocery bag. Oh, you're working today. Her tone sounded pleasant enough. Just helping Grandma organize some paperwork, I replied. Susan looked at the folders. You really don't need to bother with all of that. Grandma answered before I could. I asked her. Susan smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. I know, Mom. I just don't want Melanie wasting her weekends. I choose how I spend my weekends, I said gently. For a brief moment, the room became strangely quiet. Then Susan nodded. Well, I'll stay out of your way. She disappeared toward the kitchen. Grandma waited until she could no longer hear footsteps. Let's work quickly. We began sorting documents into simple categories: household bills, insurance, medical expenses, church donations, tax records. At first, everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Then I noticed something unusual. Several church donation receipts skipped entire months. Grandma had donated to Grace Community Church every month for nearly 20 years. She never missed one. Yet the file jumped from March to June. Did you stop giving for a while? I asked. She looked surprised. No. I checked again. There should be receipts for April and May. She frowned. I remember writing those checks. Maybe they're filed somewhere else. She shook her head slowly. I keep them together. We searched every folder on the table. Nothing. It could just be a filing mistake, I said. Maybe it was, but my instincts quietly disagreed. As I scanned each document, I created digital folders exactly the way I organized records at work: bank statements, medical, taxes, charitable giving, correspondence. Grandma watched me with quiet satisfaction. I always knew you'd make things easy to understand. I smiled. You taught me organization. No, she smiled back. I taught you patience. The scanner hummed softly between us. Page after page disappeared into digital storage. Then Grandma handed me a thin envelope. Open this one. Inside were letters from her attorney, Rebecca Collins. Most concerned routine updates regarding her estate. Nothing unusual. Except one letter referred to an annual review meeting that Grandma insisted had never happened. I don't remember canceling that appointment. The letter stated otherwise. According to the attorney's office, the meeting had supposedly been postponed at the family's request. Did you ask someone to call for you? I asked. No. You never discussed postponing it. She looked genuinely confused. I was looking forward to it. I made a copy of the letter before placing it back inside the envelope. Maybe it's a misunderstanding. I hope so. Neither of us mentioned Susan, not once. Around noon, Susan joined us carrying sandwiches. I figured accountants forget to eat. Grandma laughed. That part hasn't changed since Melanie was 12. Lunch felt surprisingly normal. Susan chatted about grocery prices, Ethan's new apartment, and church volunteers. If someone had walked into the room at that moment, they would have seen an ordinary family. No arguments, no accusations, no hostility. That normalcy made what happened next even stranger. As Susan collected the empty plates, Grandma asked casually, "Where did the donation book go?" Susan stopped. "What donation book?" "The little notebook where I kept every church contribution." Susan thought for a second. "I haven't seen it." "You helped clean my desk last month." "I only threw away junk mail." Grandma looked unconvinced. "I know I kept it." Susan shrugged. "It'll turn up." Then she quickly changed the subject. "Mom, don't you have physical therapy in an hour?" Grandma hesitated. "I suppose." The conversation ended, but not because either of us believed the answer. Over the next several weeks, I visited as often as my schedule allowed. Patterns slowly emerged. Every visit revealed another small inconsistency, an insurance statement that Grandma remembered signing but couldn't locate. A folder suddenly moved from the study into Susan's bedroom closet. Prescription receipts filed in the wrong month. Mail already opened before Grandma ever saw it. Individually, none of those details proved wrongdoing. Together, they painted a picture I couldn't ignore. I started carrying a notebook, not because I wanted to investigate my aunt, because Grandma had asked for facts. Every visit, I wrote down simple observations: date, time, documents reviewed, questions Grandma asked. Nothing more. No opinions, no conclusions, only facts. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I arrived to find Nurse Olivia Parker adjusting Grandma's blankets in the living room. Olivia greeted me warmly. "She was asking whether you'd be coming." "I try not to disappoint her." Grandma smiled weakly. "I knew you would." She looked noticeably thinner. Speaking seemed to require more effort than before. After Olivia stepped into the kitchen to prepare medication, Grandma reached for my hand. "Would you do something for me?" "Anything. If I become too tired to explain things later." She paused to catch her breath. "Don't stop asking questions." I squeezed her hand gently. "You'll explain everything yourself." She smiled sadly. "I hope so." But something in her eyes suggested she wasn't certain. That afternoon, Pastor David Reynolds stopped by for his regular visit. He had known Grandma for nearly 30 years. He prayed with her every Wednesday, brought church bulletins, and somehow always knew how to make her laugh. After prayer, Susan excused herself to answer a phone call outside. The house suddenly became unusually quiet. Grandma looked toward Pastor David. "I need a favor." "Anything." She pointed toward a small writing pad on the side table. "Help me write." Her hands trembled too much to write comfortably on their own. Pastor David sat beside her. She slowly dictated several sentences. He wrote exactly what she said. When she finished, she carefully signed the bottom with slightly shaky handwriting. Then she folded the paper once. Keep this." Pastor David accepted it without reading. "Are you sure?" "Yes." "When should I open it?" "You'll know." He nodded respectfully. "I'll keep it safe." Grandma looked relieved. She didn't explain what she had written. Neither did he ask. It wasn't my place to interrupt. A little later, Nurse Olivia returned carrying medication. Grandma looked at both of them. "I have one more request." Olivia leaned closer. "If Melanie ever needs something after I'm gone—" She stopped to catch her breath again. "Give it to her yourself." Olivia frowned slightly. "What exactly—" Grandma smiled. "You'll know when the time comes." Olivia exchanged a quick glance with Pastor David. Neither of them questioned her. Years of hospice work had probably taught Olivia that dying people often knew exactly what they wanted. As evening approached, I packed my scanner. Every document Grandma had asked me to preserve now existed in digital form. I slipped the flash drive into my purse. Grandma noticed. "Good. You'll always have the originals." She shook her head. "Paper disappears." Then she tapped lightly against my purse. "Copies survive." Driving home that night, I replayed every conversation in my mind. Missing receipts, canceled appointments, relocated files, the handwritten document Pastor David had taken, Grandma asking Nurse Olivia to deliver something after her death. None of it formed a complete picture. Not yet. But for the first time in my life, I realized Grandma wasn't preparing for the possibility that someone might twist the truth after she was gone. She was preparing for the certainty that someone would. 3 days later, my phone rang just before dawn. The caller ID showed Nurse Olivia Parker. But before I answered, I already knew why she was calling. I answered before the second ring. "Olivia." There was a brief silence. "I'm so sorry, Melanie." Her voice was calm, practiced and gentle in the way only someone who had delivered too many heartbreaking phone calls could be. "Mrs. Eleanor Barnes passed peacefully about 20 minutes ago." I closed my eyes. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Even though I had known this day was coming, the words still knocked the air out of me. "When—" "Just after 5. "Was she alone?" "No." Olivia smiled softly through the phone. "I was with her." That answer brought me more comfort than I expected. "Thank you." "She wasn't afraid?" Another long silence settled between us. Then Olivia said something that immediately sharpened my attention. "She asked me to remind you of something." "What was it? Facts first." A lump formed in my throat. That sounded exactly like Grandma. "I'll never forget." "I know you won't." After we hung up, I sat in my car outside my apartment for nearly 15 minutes before I could force myself to drive. I wasn't thinking about money, or documents, or family disagreements. I was simply grieving the woman who had quietly shaped every important decision in my life. The funeral home announced visitation would be held 3 days later, followed by the service on Saturday morning at Grace Community Church. I expected Susan to call. She didn't. I texted her that afternoon. "I'm so sorry. Please let me know how I can help with the arrangements." No response. The following morning, I emailed her. I'd like to help with flowers, photos, or anything else Grandma would have wanted. Again, nothing. I assumed she was overwhelmed. Grief affects everyone differently. 2 days later, I learned the truth wasn't nearly that simple. My cousin Ethan called. "Hey." His voice sounded awkward. "You okay?" "As okay as I can be." There was another pause. "I heard you couldn't make the planning meeting." I frowned. "What planning meeting?" "The one at the funeral home yesterday." "I wasn't invited." Silence. "I thought you said you were too busy." My stomach tightened. "No, Mom told everyone you couldn't take time off work." I looked at my calendar. I had canceled every client meeting for the entire week.
I never said that.
Ethan sounded genuinely confused.
Oh!
He quickly changed the subject.
I should go.
After we hung up, I stared at my phone. Someone hadn't simply forgotten to invite me. Someone had told the family I chose not to come. I opened my email. No invitation, no group message, nothing. I searched my text history.
Nothing there either. That evening, I called 2 of my aunts. Both conversations followed the same pattern.
We figured you needed space.
I heard work came first. Susan said you didn't want to get involved.
Each sentence landed harder than the last. By bedtime, I realized something painful. My absence hadn't been accidental. It had been explained. Just not by me. The next morning, I decided to stop guessing. I searched my sent folder. Every email I'd sent Susan was still there. Each one had a timestamp. Every one had been delivered. None had received a reply. Then I checked my phone records. 5 calls, 3 voicemail messages, 2 text messages, all unanswered.
I wasn't trying to convince myself anymore. I was documenting
exactly the way Grandma had taught me. Facts, nothing more. That afternoon, I stopped by the funeral home, hoping to contribute photographs for the memorial slideshow. The receptionist smiled politely. I'm sorry. For what?
The family already finalized everything yesterday.
I have additional family pictures. She hesitated. I'm afraid Mrs. Mitchell specifically instructed us not to make further changes. Mrs. Mitchell? Susan. Did she say why? The receptionist looked uncomfortable. She said the program had already been approved. Her expression suggested there was more she wanted to say but couldn't. I thanked her anyway. As I turned toward the parking lot, I noticed a large display board through the lobby window. The memorial slideshow had already begun cycling through photographs. There were dozens of pictures. Grandma with church friends, Grandma gardening, Grandma holding newborn grandchildren, family vacations, Christmas dinners, birthdays. Then I noticed something impossible to ignore. I wasn't in a single photograph. Not one. At first I thought it had to be coincidence. Then I remembered something. Every Christmas for the past 15 years, Grandma insisted we take one photograph together beside the fireplace. Every birthday, every Easter, every Thanksgiving. Hundreds of pictures existed, yet somehow every image, including me, had disappeared. That wasn't forgetfulness. It was editing. Deliberate editing. I stood there for nearly a minute before quietly walking away. I refused to cry in the funeral home's parking lot. Instead, I drove to Grandma's house. The driveway was crowded with cars belonging to relatives sorting through clothes and decorations. When I walked inside, carrying 2 framed photographs of Grandma and me, conversation slowed. Susan emerged from the dining room. Oh! Her smile appeared immediately, but it looked practiced. I didn't know you were coming. I brought photos for the service. She barely glanced at them. We've already finished. I saw. She folded her arms.
We have enough.
I'd still like Grandma to be represented honestly. Susan's expression cooled. Are you suggesting she isn't? I'm asking why there isn't a single picture of us together. Several relatives suddenly became very interested in the coffee table. Nobody spoke. Susan answered smoothly. We were limited on space. I held up the 2 frames. They each hold 1 picture. We already made our selections. Without asking me. We didn't think it was necessary. Her voice remained perfectly calm, almost gentle. That calmness somehow hurt more than shouting would have. I looked around the room. Did anyone here know I offered to help? No one answered. Susan answered for them. Melanie? She sighed as though speaking to someone being unreasonable. This isn't about you.
No.
I nodded slowly. It should be about Grandma. For a brief second, something flickered across Susan's face. Not anger, not guilt, relief, as though she believed the conversation was over. I picked up the photographs. I'll keep these. She didn't stop me. As I reached the front door, I heard Ethan behind me.
Mel!
I turned. He walked outside after me. I honestly thought you didn't want to be involved. I wanted to help from the first day.
I didn't know. I believe you.
He looked embarrassed. I should have asked you myself.
Yes.
He lowered his eyes. I'm sorry. It wasn't enough to repair the damage, but it mattered. Someone had finally admitted they accepted someone else's version without checking the facts. The following afternoon, I was organizing Grandma's scanned files on my laptop when my phone rang.
Olivia.
Hi.
Melanie, are you home?
Yes. I'd like to stop by. Her voice sounded unusually serious.
Of course.
She arrived 30 minutes later carrying a plain manila envelope sealed with dark blue wax. My name was written across the front in Grandma's unmistakable handwriting. Melanie Barnes Olivia held it with both hands instead of immediately giving it to me.
Your grandmother was very specific.
I looked at the envelope. When did she prepare this?
About 2 weeks before she passed. What's inside?
I honestly don't know. You never opened it. She shook her head. I promised her I wouldn't. She finally placed it in my hands. She gave me exact instructions. What were they? Olivia looked directly into my eyes. She said if everything happened peacefully, this envelope should remain sealed. My heartbeat quickened. And if it didn't? Olivia took a slow breath. Then you'd know exactly when it mattered. I stared down at the envelope. For the first time since Grandma died, I felt something stronger than grief. I felt that she had been preparing me for a moment that hadn't happened yet, and somehow she already knew exactly who would create it.
I didn't open the envelope. Not that afternoon,
not that evening. Not even after spending nearly an hour turning it over in my hands, tracing the familiar curve of Grandma's handwriting with my thumb. Every instinct I had as an accountant told me to gather information immediately. Every instinct I had as her granddaughter told me to honor her instructions. If Grandma believed I would know when the envelope mattered, then opening it too early would mean I didn't trust her judgment. So I placed it inside my home safe right beside the flash drive containing every scanned document we'd organized together. Then I waited. Saturday arrived gray and cool with the kind of steady autumn drizzle that seemed determined to make every goodbye a little heavier. I dressed in the navy suit Grandma always said made me look like someone people should listen to. Before leaving my apartment, I picked up the sealed envelope. Not because I planned to open it, because somehow it felt wrong to leave it behind. 40 minutes later, I turned into the parking lot of Grace Community Church. Cars already filled nearly every space. Church volunteers stood beneath umbrellas helping elderly guests reach the entrance. Inside those brick walls were people who had known my grandmother for decades. People whose weddings she had attended, whose children she had rocked in the nursery, whose illnesses she had prayed over. She deserved to be remembered honestly. I took a deep breath and walked toward the front doors. I never made it inside.
Melanie!
Susan's voice cut across the courtyard before I reached the steps. She was standing beneath the church awning, wearing a black dress and pearl necklace Grandma had given her years earlier. 2 of my aunts stood beside her. Several cousins lingered just inside the glass doors. Conversations gradually stopped as everyone noticed me. Susan walked forward until she completely blocked the entrance.
You shouldn't have come.
People stared. Some looked uncomfortable. Others simply watched. I kept my voice calm. I'm here to say goodbye to Grandma. Susan folded her hands in front of her. No, I'm her granddaughter. And I'm her daughter. Her tone remained surprisingly controlled. Mom didn't want unnecessary conflict today. I frowned. What conflict? She looked directly at the relatives gathered behind her before speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. You abandoned this family months ago. A quiet murmur spread through the entrance hall. You barely visited. You refused to help. You ignored your grandmother when she needed you. Each sentence sounded rehearsed, as though she'd repeated them many times before today. I didn't raise my voice. I visited almost every week. Susan shook her head sympathetically. That's not what happened. It is. You can tell yourself whatever helps you sleep. Several relatives exchanged uncertain glances. I recognized the expressions, not hatred, confusion. They genuinely believed her, because she'd been telling the story for months. One of my older uncles cleared his throat. Maybe today isn't the day. Susan nodded appreciatively. Exactly. Then she looked back at me. I think Grandma would want you to respect her wishes. Something inside me broke. Not because Susan rejected me, because she was using Grandma's voice to do it. The woman who had taught me honesty, the woman who had asked me to collect facts instead of arguments, the woman who had hugged me every weekend. Susan was speaking as though she alone could decide what Grandma wanted. I almost reached into my purse. The emails, the phone logs, the scanned documents. I had enough to challenge several of her claims. Then I remembered Grandma's last promise. Never argue until you can prove every word. This wasn't the place. Not on the church steps, not before her funeral. I slowly lowered my hand. I won't argue with you. Susan looked almost surprised. I just want to sit quietly and pay my respects. I'm sorry. Her voice grew firmer. You aren't welcome. She stepped closer. So please leave. At that exact moment, something caught my attention. Susan wasn't looking at my face anymore. Her eyes had dropped to the manila envelope tucked beneath my arm. For the briefest second, every trace of confidence disappeared from her expression. Fear. Real fear. She knew that envelope existed, or at least suspected it did. Interesting. Because nobody except Nurse Olivia and I knew Grandma had left anything in my care. I followed Susan's gaze. Without thinking, I adjusted my grip on the envelope. She immediately looked away. My mind began connecting pieces that had never quite fit before. Missing documents, controlled communication, edited photographs, false stories, and now, fear of one sealed envelope she had never seen. Whatever Susan believed was inside, she clearly didn't want it entering the church. Before either of us spoke again, the front doors opened. Pastor David Reynolds stepped outside wearing his black clergy robe. He smiled politely at several mourners before noticing the silence. His eyes moved from Susan to me, to the relatives gathered around us. What seems to be the problem? Susan answered immediately. Nothing serious. Pastor David looked at me. Melanie. Before I could speak, Susan interrupted again. Mom made it very clear she didn't want Melanie attending. The pastor's expression changed almost imperceptibly. I see. He looked at Susan for a long moment. Then he quietly asked one simple question. When did your mother tell you that? Susan hesitated. She mentioned it. When? Another pause. During hospice. Pastor David nodded once. Then he reached into the leather portfolio he carried beneath his arm. I believe there's something everyone should hear before today's service begins. Susan stiffened. What do you mean? He carefully removed a folded sheet of cream-colored stationery. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Grandma's. Susan recognized it too. The color drained from her face. Pastor David spoke calmly, but his voice carried across the church entrance. About 3 weeks before Eleanor passed away, she asked me to keep this document sealed. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I was instructed to read it publicly if there was any disagreement regarding who should attend today's service. Susan's breathing visibly changed. Pastor, she tried to smile. I'm sure that's unnecessary. He looked at her kindly. I'm afraid it isn't. He unfolded the paper. Several relatives instinctively stepped closer. The rain continued falling softly around us. The only sound was the rustling of the letter in Pastor David's hands. He adjusted his glasses, then began reading aloud. To Pastor David Reynolds, if you are reading this, someone has attempted to prevent my granddaughter Melanie Barnes from attending my funeral. A collective gasp swept through the entrance. Pastor David continued. Melanie has stood beside me with honesty, patience, and dignity throughout my final months. Any statement claiming I wished to exclude her is false. I closed my eyes for a second. Hearing Grandma defend me in her own words hurt almost as much as it healed. The pastor continued reading. I ask that Melanie be welcomed with love and seated in the front row. She has earned that place not because she is my granddaughter, but because she honored me by choosing truth over conflict. No one looked at me anymore. Every eye had turned towards Susan. She stood perfectly still. The confidence she'd carried only moments earlier had vanished. One of my aunts covered her mouth. Ethan stared at his mother in complete disbelief. Pastor David folded the letter carefully. Eleanor signed this document in my presence. He paused. Nurse Olivia Parker witnessed her signature. Then he looked directly at me. Melanie, his voice softened. Your grandmother asked that you come inside. I didn't smile. I didn't feel victorious. The only thing I felt was overwhelming sadness that Grandma had known she needed to protect my place at her own funeral. As I stepped through the church doors, relatives quietly moved aside. Several avoided my eyes. Others whispered apologies that barely rose above the sound of the rain. Susan remained frozen near the entrance. For the first time in months, she wasn't controlling the room. The service itself was beautiful. Pastor David spoke about Grandma's generosity, her faith, and her quiet habit of helping people without asking for recognition. I cried more than once, not because of everything Susan had done, because every story reminded me of ordinary afternoons drinking coffee, balancing checkbooks, and listening to Grandma insist that a person's reputation was built one honest choice at a time. After the final hymn ended, Pastor David returned to the pulpit instead of dismissing everyone. There is one final instruction Eleanor asked me to deliver. The congregation became silent once again. He unfolded another page. This request concerns only immediate family. He looked toward the first pew where I sat, then toward Susan, then toward the rest of our relatives. Eleanor requested that immediately following the burial, every member of her immediate family meet with attorney Rebecca Collins before returning home. People exchanged puzzled looks. Pastor David continued. She wrote one final sentence for me to read. He glanced down at the page. No one should decide what the truth is until every record has been placed on the same table. I instinctively tightened my grip on the sealed envelope resting inside my purse. Somehow, I knew our family's hardest conversation hadn't happened outside the church. It was waiting for us after the cemetery. The cemetery was only 15 minutes from the church. Normally, after a funeral, families lingered. People hugged. Old friends shared stories. Children wandered between rows of headstones while adults quietly promised to keep in touch. That wasn't what happened after Grandma's burial. Our family dispersed with unusual speed. It wasn't because anyone was in a hurry. it was because everyone was thinking about the same thing. Why had Grandma insisted that we meet with attorney Rebecca Collins before going home? Even Susan, who usually stayed after church to thank everyone personally, climbed into her car without speaking to anyone beyond a few polite words. As I drove, I caught a glimpse of Ethan's SUV in my rearview mirror. When we stopped at a red light, he pulled alongside me and lowered his window.
Mel,
I rolled mine down. I'm sorry. His voice was sincere.
I should have questioned everything sooner.
I offered a small nod. You believed your mother.
I did.
I understand why. He looked away for a moment.
But I don't understand why Grandma knew this would happen.
Neither do I. The light turned green before either of us could say anything else. Rebecca Collins's office occupied the second floor of an old brick building downtown. Grandma had worked with Rebecca for nearly 20 years, updating her estate plan whenever life changed. The receptionist greeted us quietly and directed everyone into the firm's largest conference room. A long walnut table filled the center. Pitchers of water sat beside neatly arranged notepads. Nothing about the room felt dramatic. It looked exactly like every conference room I'd ever used during client meetings. Perhaps that was appropriate. Grandma had always believed the truth didn't need theatrics. It only needed documentation. Rebecca entered carrying 3 thick binders and a slim leather portfolio. She was in her early 50s, composed and impeccably organized. She offered condolences before taking her seat.
First, let me say how deeply sorry I am for your loss.
Everyone murmured quiet thanks. Rebecca continued. Eleanor Barnes prepared very clear written instructions concerning today's meeting. Susan folded her hands.
I assume this is about the will?
Rebecca shook her head. The will has already been admitted for administration. A flicker of surprise crossed several faces. This meeting concerns a separate request. Susan frowned. What request? Rebecca opened the leather portfolio. Approximately 4 months ago, your mother amended one section of her estate planning documents. No one interrupted. She instructed me that immediately following her funeral, I was to gather the immediate family and begin an independent review of certain financial records connected to her personal accounts and charitable giving. The room became still. Susan gave a short laugh.
That sounds unnecessary.
Rebecca calmly looked up. Eleanor didn't consider it unnecessary. Susan shifted in her chair. My mother trusted me with her finances. I understand. Rebecca spoke without emotion. She also instructed me not to rely solely on any one person's recollection. The sentence landed heavily. Rebecca continued. She specifically requested that all relevant records be reviewed together so that no misunderstandings could continue after her death. One of my aunts finally spoke. Are you saying she thought someone stole from her? Rebecca answered carefully. I'm saying Eleanor wanted transparency. That wording caught my attention. Not accusation. Transparency. Exactly the language Grandma would have chosen. Susan leaned back. Well, I have nothing to hide. I appreciate that. Rebecca smiled politely. Then today's review should be straightforward. She opened the first binder. Inside were copies of bank statements, canceled checks, donation summaries, and correspondence from various charities. I've already gathered records from the financial institutions and organizations your mother authorized us to contact. That surprised me. Grandma hadn't merely asked for a review. She had arranged for the records to be collected before anyone else could object. Rebecca placed several documents onto the table. Eleanor also instructed me to compare these records against any personal files retained by family members. Susan immediately answered. I brought everything from the house. Rebecca nodded. Thank you. Then she turned toward me. Melanie.
Yes. Your grandmother left me very specific instructions concerning you.
Every eye in the room shifted toward me. Rebecca read directly from a typed memorandum. If Melanie still has the copies I asked her to make, ask her to bring them. She will know which ones I mean. I felt dozens of eyes studying me. I slowly reached beside my chair and lifted my laptop bag onto the table. I brought them. Susan's posture changed almost instantly. You brought what? I removed a neatly labeled accordion folder, then the encrypted flash drive. I scanned every document Grandma personally asked me to preserve. Susan stared. When? Over several visits. I never saw you do that. Grandma wanted it done quietly. Rebecca looked neither surprised nor concerned. As Eleanor expected, she turned toward me. Would you mind explaining how these copies were created? I spoke the same way I explained financial procedures to nonprofit boards. No legal language, no accounting jargon, just facts. Grandma asked me to organize her records because she was worried her memory was becoming unreliable. I laid the first folder on the table. We categorized every document before scanning it. I pointed to labeled sections: bank statements, medical records, property taxes, church donations, correspondence. Everything was scanned in chronological order. Rebecca nodded approvingly. Were any documents altered? No. Annotated. No. Did you remove anything from her home? Only digital copies stored on this flash drive. Did Eleanor know you kept those copies? She insisted. Rebecca smiled faintly. That's consistent with my notes. Susan finally interrupted. This is ridiculous. Everyone turned toward her. They're just copies. Rebecca remained calm. Copies can be extremely useful. Susan crossed her arms. Why? Because copies preserve what existed at a particular moment. Silence filled the room. Rebecca continued. If originals are later misplaced, reorganized, or accidentally discarded, she paused. A dated copy can establish whether something previously existed. No one spoke. Susan looked away. Rebecca opened the second binder. This is where things become interesting. She laid several church donation summaries beside the copies from my scanner. Melanie? Yes. Would you compare these? I leaned forward. At first glance, they looked identical. Then I noticed it. The April receipt. Rebecca nodded. What about it? It's missing from the church records Susan brought. I checked another stack. So is May. Then another. And August. I reached for my scanned copies. They're here. I carefully aligned the documents side by side. The room fell silent. My copies contained 3 donation receipts that no longer appeared in the household files. Not enormous amounts, but enough to matter. Rebecca wrote several notes. Susan immediately spoke. Mom probably misplaced them. Possibly. Rebecca's tone remained neutral. We'll continue. Next came correspondence with the attorney's office. Then tax documents. Then household expense summaries. Most matched perfectly. A few didn't. Nothing dramatic. Nothing sensational. Just enough small inconsistencies to justify Grandma's concerns. As the review continued, I realized something important. This wasn't becoming a criminal investigation. It was becoming a reconstruction. Grandma had anticipated confusion after her death. She wanted the facts placed back into their original order. No assumptions, no accusations, just chronology. After nearly an hour, Rebecca closed one binder and looked around the room. We've confirmed several discrepancies requiring clarification. Susan immediately asked, What kind of discrepancies? Rebecca answered carefully. Documents that existed in Melanie's scanned archive, but are absent from the household files. Susan forced a smile. That doesn't prove anything. No, Rebecca agreed.
It proves only that additional explanation is necessary. She opened the final binder. There is one category we have not yet discussed. Everyone waited. Rebecca looked directly at Susan. Reimbursements? Susan blinked. What reimbursements? Rebecca slowly removed a spreadsheet from the binder. The reimbursements Eleanor authorized for caregiving expenses. I noticed Susan's fingers tighten around the edge of her chair. For the first time all afternoon, she didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. She simply stared at the spreadsheet as if she already knew exactly what was printed on the next page. No one spoke for several seconds. The silence wasn't dramatic. It was cautious. Everyone in that room understood that caring for an aging parent costs money. Gasoline, groceries, medical supplies, home modifications. Nobody expected Susan to pay every expense herself. Grandma certainly hadn't. Rebecca folded her hands. Before anyone reaches conclusions, I'd like to explain what we're reviewing. I silently appreciated that. Grandma had hired exactly the kind of attorney she respected, someone who explained before accusing. Eleanor authorized Susan to receive reimbursements for legitimate caregiving expenses. Rebecca continued, That's a common arrangement. It allows a family caregiver to avoid paying household costs out of pocket. Several relatives nodded. One of my uncles said quietly, That sounds reasonable. It is, Rebecca replied, provided the reimbursements are documented. She slid a spreadsheet toward the center of the table. This schedule lists every reimbursement Eleanor approved during the last 3 years. I leaned forward. The document was remarkably organized. Date, amount, purpose, supporting receipt, authorization. Everything appeared orderly until the final column. Several entries were highlighted in yellow. Rebecca noticed me looking. Those are the transactions requiring clarification. Susan finally spoke. Clarification from who? From anyone who can provide it. Susan gave a short laugh. I bought groceries every week. I'm sure you did. I drove Mom to appointments. I don't doubt that. I practically lived in her house. Rebecca nodded. None of those facts are being challenged. Susan's shoulders relaxed slightly. Then Rebecca added one more sentence. What we need is the paperwork connected to several reimbursements. The tension returned immediately. Rebecca pointed to the first highlighted line. $842,017. Home maintenance. Supporting receipt unavailable. Susan answered quickly. The plumber. Rebecca looked down. The invoice says landscaping. Susan blinked. Oh, I may be remembering the wrong expense. Rebecca simply made another note. She moved to the next item. 600 fine. Medical supplies. No receipt. Susan frowned. I paid cash. Do you remember where? No. Rebecca nodded without comment. Again, she simply wrote something in her notebook. The process continued. One transaction after another. Most had documentation. Several did not. Nothing suggested millions of dollars. Nothing suggested elaborate fraud. Instead, the pattern was something much more believable. Poor records, missing documentation, and explanations that shifted depending on the question. Eventually, Rebecca paused. I'd like to compare these with another set of records. She turned toward me. Melanie. I opened my laptop. I indexed Grandma's scanned documents by date. Susan looked at me. You indexed them. I organize records for a living. Rebecca smiled. Could you pull up March of last year? Within seconds, the documents appeared. We reviewed them together, then April, then May. Each month matched the digital index Grandma and I had created. As we progressed, another pattern slowly emerged. Grandma had kept handwritten notes beside many expenses, not detailed journals, just small reminders. Church roof fund. Wheelchair ramp donation. Susan bought groceries. Paid electric bill. Simple observations. Grandma's handwriting filled the margins. Rebecca compared one note with the reimbursement schedule. Eleanor wrote that Susan paid the electric bill herself. Susan nodded. I did. The reimbursement request submitted 2 weeks later lists replacement curtains. Susan hesitated. She looked at the spreadsheet. I don't remember. Rebecca didn't press. She simply moved on. After nearly 2 hours, Ethan suddenly spoke for the first time. Mom? Susan turned toward him. What? Can I ask something? Of course. Why didn't you keep better records? She sighed heavily. I wasn't thinking like an accountant. No one expected you to. Ethan looked genuinely confused, but Grandma always kept every receipt. Susan rubbed her forehead. I was exhausted. No one argued with that. Caregiving was exhausting. Everyone knew it. Rebecca acknowledged it immediately. Fatigue can absolutely affect record keeping. Susan looked grateful, then Rebecca continued. Fatigue, however, doesn't explain something else. She reached into the final binder. I'd like everyone to look at these. She passed around copies of several emails. I recognized them immediately. They were mine. The emails I'd sent offering help. Rebecca waited until everyone finished reading. Each of these emails was sent to Susan. Susan remained silent. They include offers to purchase groceries. Another page. Coordinate hospice visits. Another. Drive Eleanor to appointments. Another. Review insurance paperwork. Rebecca folded her hands. None received responses. One aunt looked toward Susan. You never answered her. Susan stared at the papers. I meant to. Rebecca nodded. That's possible. She turned another page. I also obtained communication logs from Eleanor's estate records. I frowned. What communication logs? Eleanor requested copies of certain correspondence from our office. Rebecca slid forward another document. The office contacted Susan 3 times requesting a family meeting regarding estate updates. Susan looked down. Rebecca continued. Each time the office was informed that Melanie was unavailable because of work. Every head slowly turned toward me. I spoke quietly. I was never contacted. Rebecca nodded. Our records indicate you were not copied. The room grew noticeably heavier. Nobody was looking at me anymore. They were looking at Susan. Ethan finally whispered, Mom. Susan closed her eyes. I know. You told us Melanie was too busy. I believed she was. I looked at her. You never asked. She didn't answer. Rebecca calmly intervened. I think we're approaching the heart of Eleanor's concern. She stood and walked toward the window before continuing. I've reviewed financial disputes for over 20 years. She looked back at us. Very few begin with stolen money. That surprised several relatives. They usually begin with control. She let that sentence settle. One person becomes the source of every piece of information. The calendar, the appointments, the paperwork, the conversations, the explanations, and eventually, she looked directly at Susan. Everyone else stops verifying. No one interrupted, because she was right. Rebecca returned to her seat. At this point, I have found no evidence suggesting Eleanor's estate was emptied. A visible wave of relief moved through the room. I have also found no evidence of large-scale theft. Another quiet breath spread across the table. Then she added, but I have found repeated examples of undocumented reimbursements, incomplete records, missing donation receipts, and communication that presented Melanie as unwilling to participate despite evidence showing otherwise. Those words carried more weight than any accusation. They were precise, supported,
measured, exactly the way Grandma would have wanted. Susan finally spoke. Her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. I didn't think it would get this far. Rebecca didn't respond. Susan looked down at the table. I wasn't trying to steal from Mom. Nobody answered. I know how this looks. She swallowed hard. But that's not what happened. For the first time since the meeting began, there wasn't anger in her face, only exhaustion, real exhaustion. I quit my job. She looked toward no one in particular. I spent almost 4 years taking care of her. I watched my savings disappear. I watched my retirement stop growing. I watched my friends keep living while every day looked exactly the same. Tears slowly formed in her eyes. I told myself I'd sort out the receipts later. She laughed bitterly. Later never came. No one moved. No one interrupted. Then her voice changed. Quieter. I also hated something. She looked toward me. I hated that every time Mom talked about you. Another pause. Her face lit up. I stared at her. I know that wasn't your fault. She shook her head. But it still hurt. She wiped her eyes. I started convincing myself that if everyone believed you stayed away. She couldn't finish. Ethan whispered, then Grandma would need you less. Susan nodded almost imperceptibly. And maybe another tear slipped down her face. People would finally see how much I was sacrificing. The room became unbearably quiet. I finally understood something I'd been missing for months. Susan hadn't been trying to erase me because she wanted my career, or my money, or Grandma's affection. She wanted acknowledgement. She wanted someone to see how lonely caregiving had made her. Instead of asking for that compassion, she tried to earn it by making me look absent. It explained everything, but it didn't excuse any of it. Rebecca gently closed the final binder. I believe Eleanor understood that distinction. She reached into her leather portfolio one last time. There is one remaining document. She carefully removed a cream-colored envelope. Across the front in Grandma's unmistakable handwriting were 5 words. For my daughter Susan. Rebecca looked at Susan quietly. Your mother instructed me to wait until every document had been reviewed. She placed the envelope on the table. Before anyone heard her final message to you. Fan 8. No one reached for the envelope. Susan stared at it as though it weighed far more than a single sheet of paper ever could. The room remained completely still. Rebecca finally spoke. Eleanor left specific instructions. She opened her file and read aloud. My letter to Susan should be read after the financial review is complete, and after everyone has had the opportunity to see the same records. I don't want my words used to avoid accountability, nor do I want accountability to erase compassion. That sounded exactly like Grandma. Balanced, clear, never interested in humiliating anyone. Rebecca looked at Susan. Would you like to read it yourself, or would you prefer that I read it aloud? Susan swallowed. You read it. Rebecca nodded and carefully unfolded the handwritten pages. Even from where I sat, I recognized Grandma's elegant cursive. She began reading. My dear Susan, if this letter is being read, then my greatest fear came true. Not that mistakes were made, we all make mistakes, but that silence and assumptions became stronger than honesty. Before anyone listening today believes I loved one child more than another, let me tell you something I should have said years ago. I have always seen how much you carried. Susan lowered her head. Rebecca continued. I saw the appointments no one thanked you for, the sleepless nights, the medications, the endless paperwork, the meals you cooked after long days when you wanted nothing more than to rest. You gave me time I could never repay. Susan quietly wiped away a tear. Several relatives did the same. Then the letter changed. But love cannot survive where truth is hidden. Caregiving does not give us permission to decide who belongs in a family. Exhaustion does not give us permission to rewrite another person's character. Loneliness does not give us permission to speak for someone else's heart. The words settled over the room like a gentle but immovable weight. Rebecca paused briefly before continuing. You told people Melanie stayed away. You answered questions that should have been mine to answer. You controlled conversations that should have belonged to all of us. Perhaps you believed you were protecting yourself. Perhaps you believed you were protecting me. You were doing neither. Susan's shoulders trembled. I love Melanie differently than I love you. Not more, not less. Differently. A mother's love and a grandmother's love are not competitors unless someone insists they must be. I felt my throat tighten. Grandma had understood something I never had. Susan hadn't been fighting me. She had been comparing herself to me. A comparison Grandma had never intended. Rebecca continued reading. If Melanie is sitting in this room, then she kept the promise she made to me. She waited for evidence instead of anger. That choice makes me proud. If you are listening, Susan, then you still have an opportunity that many people never receive. Tell the truth before someone forces it from you. Truth offered freely heals faster than truth uncovered. Susan covered her mouth. Soft sobs escaped before she could stop them. The letter wasn't condemning her. That somehow made it harder to hear. Rebecca reached the final page. I forgive your fear. I do not excuse your choices. Those are different things. If you love me, let people remember me for honesty instead of conflict. Repair what you damaged. Accept whatever consequences follow. Then let your future speak more loudly than today's embarrassment. With all my love, Mom. Rebecca carefully folded the letter. No one spoke. No one seemed capable of speaking. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. Mom! Susan looked at him through tears. I'm sorry. He nodded slowly. I know. Then he added quietly, but you don't only owe that to me. Susan turned toward me. For months, I had imagined this moment. I thought I would feel satisfied, vindicated, victorious. Instead, I mostly felt tired. Susan looked directly into my eyes for the first time since Grandma died. I'm sorry, Melanie. Her voice shook. I kept telling myself I wasn't lying. I listened without interrupting. I'd tell one small story. She looked down. Then another. Eventually, she gave a defeated laugh. I had to keep inventing explanations to protect the first ones. I understood exactly what she meant. I'd seen similar situations during financial investigations. Rarely did someone wake up intending to deceive dozens of people. More often, one poor decision demanded another until the original truth became almost impossible to admit. Susan continued. When everyone praised me, she hesitated. It felt good. I hated myself for needing it. But I still wanted it. She wiped another tear away. So, every time someone asked why you weren't there, she couldn't finish the sentence. I answered before anyone could ask you. I nodded slowly. I know. She looked surprised. You know, I figured it out. She lowered her eyes. I never thought it would reach the funeral. I believe you. I honestly thought, she stopped, that if you stayed away one last time, another long silence, nobody would ever question the story. Rebecca quietly slid a box of tissues toward her, then she addressed the room. Eleanor left one additional written recommendation. She removed another page from the file. It isn't legally binding. She smiled gently. It's simply her wish. Rebecca read aloud.
Do not spend my savings fighting each other in court if a fair solution can still be reached through honesty and accountability. Several relatives exchanged thoughtful glances. Grandma had anticipated even this. Rebecca continued. Eleanor believed the financial discrepancies could likely be resolved without prolonged litigation if everyone cooperated. She looked at me. As the individual whose reputation was most directly harmed, she paused. The next decision belongs largely to you. The room became silent again. Every face turned toward me. I understood what Rebecca meant. Legally, there were options. Some of the undocumented reimbursements could potentially be recovered. The false statements about me had damaged relationships that would take years to rebuild. If I chose to pursue civil action, Rebecca would almost certainly support that decision. Grandma had left enough documentation to make the facts difficult to dispute. But Grandma hadn't spent her final months teaching me patience so I could enjoy humiliating someone. She had taught me patience because it created room for wise decisions. I looked around the conference room. My relatives looked embarrassed. Ethan looked heartbroken. Susan looked completely defeated. No one appeared triumphant, least of all me. I finally spoke. I need some time before making any legal decisions. Rebecca nodded immediately. I think that's wise. Susan whispered, Whatever you decide. She struggled to meet my eyes again. I'll accept it. I believed she meant it. Not because she'd suddenly become a different person. Because the version of reality she'd spent months constructing had collapsed in a single afternoon. There was nothing left to defend. As everyone slowly gathered their belongings, Rebecca asked if I could remain behind for a few minutes. The others quietly left the conference room. Susan was the last to reach the door. Before stepping into the hallway, she turned back. I'm going to tell the rest of the family the truth. I simply nodded. After the door closed, Rebecca sat back down. There are still legal matters we should discuss. I expected her to begin explaining settlement procedures. Instead, she opened one final folder. Inside was a handwritten note from Grandma attached to a yellow sticky tab. Rebecca slid it across the table. Eleanor left this instruction specifically for today's conversation. I looked down at the note. In Grandma's familiar handwriting were just 2 sentences. Justice should make tomorrow safer than yesterday. If your decision only satisfies today's anger, keep thinking. I read those words twice, then a third time. When I finally looked up, I already knew my decision would have nothing to do with revenge. It would have everything to do with making sure the truth and Grandma's legacy could never be rewritten again. I didn't make my decision that afternoon. Rebecca never pressured me to. Instead, she closed every folder, placed the documents back into their binders, and said something that reminded me of my grandmother. Time has a way of separating justice from emotion. I appreciated that more than she probably realized. The previous week had been a whirlwind of grief, public humiliation, shocking revelations, and painful apologies. Whatever decision I made needed to survive long after those emotions settled. I'd like a few days, I said. Rebecca nodded. Take them. What happens in the meantime? I'll preserve every document, notify the appropriate parties that the review is ongoing, and prepare several options. What kind of options? She slid a legal pad toward me. There isn't just one path. She wrote 3 headings. Formal civil litigation, private settlement, mediated family resolution. You have enough documentation to pursue legal claims concerning undocumented reimbursements and reputational harm, she explained. But litigation is expensive, emotionally draining, and public. She pointed to the second heading. A private settlement allows accountability without years of courtroom proceedings. Then the third. Mediation works only if everyone participates honestly. I looked at the list. I already know one option I don't want.
Court.
I nodded. Rebecca smiled gently. I suspected that. She handed me copies of the proposed settlement framework Grandma had authorized Rebecca to draft if cooperation became possible. Even now, months before her death, Grandma had anticipated that reconciliation might require structure, not vague promises, written commitments. That was exactly how she approached life. Facts first, promises second. 3 days later, we met again. This time only 5 people sat around the conference table. Rebecca, Susan, Ethan, Pastor David, me. Rebecca opened the meeting. Before we begin, I'd like to ask one question. She looked directly at Susan. Are you participating voluntarily? Yes. Have you had adequate opportunity to review the documents? Yes. Do you dispute the financial findings? Susan took a slow breath. No. It was the first completely unqualified answer I'd heard from her in months. Rebecca continued. Then I'd like to review the proposed agreement. She distributed copies. The document wasn't punitive. It was practical. Every disputed reimbursement lacking documentation would be repaid to Grandma's estate over an 18-month payment schedule. No interest, no additional penalties. The recovered funds would be donated exactly as Grandma had originally intended to Grace Community Church's Community Assistance Program and the local hospice foundation that had cared for her. Pastor David looked visibly moved. She would have loved that. Rebecca smiled. I believe she planned it that way. The second section addressed something money couldn't repair. Public reputation. Rebecca read it aloud. Susan Mitchell agrees to issue a written statement to immediate and extended family acknowledging that Melanie Barnes consistently visited Eleanor Barnes, repeatedly offered assistance, and was wrongly portrayed as unwilling to participate in Eleanor's care. The room fell silent. Susan looked down at the paper. I'll sign that. Rebecca looked surprised. You've finished reading. I don't need to. Susan looked toward me. That part is true. She paused. It should have been true from the beginning. The third section concerned the church, because several reimbursement requests had involved charitable donations and memorial funds. Grandma had recommended stronger financial oversight going forward, not because she distrusted churches, because she believed transparency protected everyone. Pastor David adjusted his glasses as he read. This recommends dual approval for memorial funds. Rebecca nodded. And annual volunteer audits. He smiled faintly. Eleanor was still improving our bookkeeping after she passed away. We all laughed softly. It was the first genuine laugh anyone had shared since Grandma died. It also felt like something she would have enjoyed. Rebecca looked toward Susan once more. The agreement also requests that you voluntarily step down from handling church financial collections for a period of 2 years. Susan didn't argue. I already planned to. You did. She nodded. I don't think people should have to wonder. Pastor David answered quietly. Trust can return. Susan looked at him. I know, but people shouldn't be asked to give it back before I've earned it. I noticed Ethan quietly smiling, not because his mother was suffering, because she was finally taking responsibility without looking for excuses. Rebecca slid the final signature page into the center of the table. One by one, everyone signed. Rebecca first, then Susan, then me. Pastor David signed as a witness. Ethan signed acknowledging he had attended the meeting. Rebecca carefully collected every page. This resolves the financial matters. She looked toward me. But there is still something else. I already knew what she meant. Family. Legal agreements could settle accounts. They couldn't rebuild relationships. That would take something entirely different. A week later, Susan mailed her written statement. She didn't hide behind vague language. She didn't minimize what had happened. She admitted that she had repeatedly told relatives I chose work over Grandma. She acknowledged that I had offered help many times. She apologized for allowing her exhaustion and resentment to shape the family's perception of me. Within days, my phone began ringing. One aunt called first. "I should have asked you. You should have." "I'm sorry." "I know." Another uncle admitted he'd judged me unfairly. A cousin sent a handwritten card saying she regretted believing rumors without ever speaking to me. The hardest conversation came from Ethan. He invited me to lunch. After we'd ordered, he stared at his coffee for nearly a minute. "I keep replaying everything." "So do I." "I feel stupid." "You were manipulated." "I was." He sighed. "But I also chose the easy version." I didn't disagree. He continued. "I trusted the person who talked the most." That sentence stayed with me because it explained more than our family. Sometimes the loudest story becomes the accepted story simply because nobody slows down long enough to verify it. Before we left the restaurant, Ethan reached into his backpack. "I found these." He handed me a small photo album. Inside were copies of family photographs, Christmas, birthdays, Easter dinners. There I was beside Grandma, laughing, decorating cookies, holding her hand in the garden. "Where did you get these?" "I found another storage box in Mom's attic." I slowly turned each page. Susan hadn't destroyed the pictures. She'd simply removed them from view. That somehow made the truth even sadder. She hadn't wanted to erase history. She'd wanted to edit the version everyone remembered. A few Sundays later, Pastor David invited me to speak briefly after the church's annual volunteer meeting. Not about our family, about financial transparency for nonprofit organizations. I almost declined. Then I remembered Grandma's words. Facts protect truth. So I accepted. I spent 20 minutes explaining simple financial safeguards that protected volunteers just as much as they protected donors. 2 people counting offerings instead of 1. Written approvals, independent reviews, clear documentation, nothing complicated, nothing personal. When I finished, Pastor David thanked me. "You honored your grandmother today." As people began leaving, Susan approached quietly. She waited until everyone else had gone. "I listened to every word." I smiled politely. "I saw. I almost didn't come." "I'm glad you did." She looked around the now empty fellowship hall. "I used to think accountability was punishment." She gave a small, tired smile. "Now I think it's the only reason people might trust me again." I nodded. I think Grandma would have agreed. Before leaving, she handed me something folded neatly inside a plain envelope. "I found this while cleaning Mom's desk." "What is it?" "I never should have kept it." When I opened the envelope, I found the missing donation notebook Grandma had searched for months before she died. Every contribution, every handwritten note, every receipt carefully recorded in her own neat handwriting. The final page contained one short sentence written only weeks before her passing. Truth has a remarkable way of finding patient people. I smiled through unexpected tears, but as I carefully closed the notebook, I remembered something waiting safely inside my home. Grandma's own sealed envelope, the one Nurse Olivia had given me, the one I still hadn't opened. For the first time, I believed I was finally ready. Fan. Tan Tchol. The sealed envelope sat in my home safe for almost 2 months after Grandma's funeral. Several times I reached for it. Several times I changed my mind. By then, the legal questions had been answered. The financial review was complete. The settlement had been signed. The church had adopted its new financial oversight policies. Susan had begun making her repayments exactly as agreed. Every monthly payment arrived on time, not because a judge forced her to, because she had finally accepted responsibility. Life had started moving again. Clients returned to filling my calendar. Tax season arrived. Church volunteers asked me to help review donation procedures. For the first time in months, I wasn't waking up thinking about courtrooms, family meetings, or missing documents. One Saturday morning, I drove to Green Lawn Cemetery carrying fresh white lilies. Grandma had always preferred flowers that looked simple rather than extravagant. "They don't have to impress anyone," she'd once said. "They're beautiful because they bloom anyway." The cemetery was quiet. A cool breeze stirred the trees while sunlight filtered through the branches. I placed the flowers beside her headstone and sat on the nearby bench. For several minutes, I said nothing. I simply looked at her name engraved in stone. Eleanor Barnes' beloved mother, grandmother, friend. Those words somehow felt too small for everything she had been. After a while, I reached into my bag. The envelope looked exactly as it had the day Olivia handed it to me. The dark blue wax seal remained unbroken. My name written in Grandma's familiar handwriting still made me smile. I carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single folded sheet of stationery. No legal documents, no hidden evidence, no surprise inheritance. Just a letter. I unfolded it slowly. "My dearest Melanie, if you are reading this, then you waited. Thank you. That tells me you trusted me even when you didn't know why." I laughed softly. "You really did know me," I whispered. I continued reading. "There are some things documents cannot protect. They cannot protect your peace. They cannot protect your heart. Only you can do that." I paused. The breeze gently lifted one corner of the page. "You became an accountant because you believed truth matters. Never lose that. But remember something equally important. Facts protect truth. Boundaries protect peace. One without the other eventually leaves a person exhausted." I felt tears gathering again. Grandma had written almost exactly what I needed to hear. Not 6 months earlier. Now, the moment everything else was over. She continued, "You will be tempted to confuse forgiveness with restored access. Please don't. Someone may sincerely regret hurting you and still need to rebuild trust over time. You can forgive without pretending nothing happened. You can love someone while refusing to hand them the keys to your life again. Healthy boundaries are not punishment. They are stewardship." I read those lines twice, then a third time. For months, I had struggled with one question. What kind of relationship should I have with Susan? Now, Grandma wasn't giving me instructions about Susan specifically. She was giving me permission to stop feeling guilty for protecting my own peace. The letter continued, "If Susan accepts responsibility, encourage her. If she refuses responsibility, pray for her anyway. Neither choice requires you to surrender your judgment." That was Grandma, always able to separate compassion from permission. The final paragraph was the shortest. "I have never been proud of you because you were successful. I have been proud of you because you never allowed success to replace kindness. Keep both. With all my love, Grandma." I folded the letter carefully. For a long time, I simply sat there listening to the wind moving through the trees. I expected to feel closure. Instead, I felt something quieter. Permission. Permission to stop carrying responsibility for choices that had never been mine. Permission to remember Grandma without replaying every painful conversation from her final months. Permission to let the future become larger than the betrayal. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps approaching. I turned.
Susan stood several yards away holding a small bouquet of yellow daisies. She looked uncertain.
I wasn't sure if you'd mind. I don't.
She walked closer but stopped at a respectful distance. Not because I asked her to, because she understood. She placed the flowers beside Grandma's headstone.
They were Mom's favorite. I know.
We stood together in silence. After a while, Susan spoke.
I've been seeing a counselor.
I looked at her.
I realized I spent years believing that asking for help meant failing.
She gave a small, embarrassed smile.
So instead, I tried to make everyone notice me by becoming indispensable.
I nodded. That must have been lonely.
It was.
She looked toward Grandma's grave. I wish I'd admitted that while she was alive.
So do I.
Another quiet silence settled between us. Then she surprised me.
I'm not asking you to trust me again.
I met her eyes.
I know. I'm just hoping that one day...
She searched for the right words.
When you've seen enough consistency, maybe we'll have coffee.
Not holidays, not family vacations, not pretending the past never happened. Just coffee. A small beginning. I smiled gently. Maybe. Wasn't a promise. It wasn't a rejection either. It was honest. And honesty had become far more valuable than easy reconciliation. Over the following years, Susan kept every commitment she had made. Each repayment was completed exactly on schedule. She volunteered at the hospice center, not handling finances, simply spending time with families whose loved ones were nearing the end of life.
She never asked anyone to praise her. She simply showed up. Pastor David later told me something that made me smile. Your grandmother is still changing people.
He was right. Grace Community Church now required 2 volunteers to oversee memorial donations. Annual financial reviews became standard practice. New caregivers received information about community support groups instead of being expected to shoulder everything alone. Grandma's difficult final chapter had quietly improved the lives of people she would never meet. As for me, I continued working as a CPA helping nonprofit organizations build systems based on transparency rather than trust alone. Whenever new board members asked why documentation mattered so much, I always answered the same way. Because good people deserve protection too. Years later, when I think about that morning outside the church, I no longer remember Susan blocking the doorway first. I remember Pastor David unfolding Grandma's letter. I remember a room full of people finally hearing the truth at exactly the same time. Most of all, I remember the greatest inheritance Grandma ever left me. It wasn't money, it wasn't property, it wasn't even evidence. It was the wisdom to understand that justice isn't measured by how completely someone falls. It's measured by whether the truth is restored, boundaries are respected, and peace has room to grow afterward. Family relationships can leave some of the deepest wounds because they shape our understanding of trust long before we know how to protect ourselves. When someone we love manipulates the truth, it is natural to question our own memories and wonder whether keeping the peace is worth sacrificing our voice. But healthy boundaries are not acts of revenge. They are acts of self-respect. Holding someone accountable does not require hatred, and forgiveness does not require giving them the same access they once abused. Sometimes the kindest choice is to allow trust to be rebuilt through consistent actions rather than sincere words alone. If you've ever been misunderstood, unfairly blamed, or pressured to stay silent for the sake of family harmony, I hope Melanie's journey reminds you that patience, evidence, and integrity can be stronger than anger. I'd love to hear your thoughts or experiences in the comments, and if stories like this speak to you, consider subscribing so we can continue exploring meaningful conversations together. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.